Our next project that we're going to be working on today is the t-shirt. But before we start talking about the layout on that, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the structure of a knit, which is really very different than the structure on a woven piece of fabric. A knit is made from one continuous thread that forms a loop, and then another loop is pulled through it. And it gets its stretch and its flexibility from those loops because they can change shape. They don't really change size, but they change shape. If I pull it this way, you can see that things are getting long and narrow in there between my fingers. And if I pull it this way, they're getting shorter and wider. Now, this is a single knit, and I actually did this on knitting needles, but it is a knit stitch, and it's just knit around in a circle. And that's the way knits are primarily done in the industry. They're knit in a tube. And when they're ready to sell them, they have to slice this tube open to make a flat piece of fabric. Now, on the knit side, these long V-shaped things here between my fingers are actually called the rib or the wale. And that's what corresponds to the lengthwise grain. On the back side of the knit is the purl stitch, and those ribs or the little humps, the little purls, if you will, that you see running around correspond to the rows or the course, which is equivalent, if you will, to the crosswise grain on a piece of fabric. So the ribs or wales are like the lengthwise grain, and the little purls that run around equate to the rows or the courses. Now I have switched stitches here so you can see a knit stitch on the purl to follow the cut that would be made to flatten out this tube to make a flat piece of fabric. Now, because this is a single knit, you can see it wants to curl, and it's curling toward the knit side or the face side of the fabric. It's because of this tendency to curl that I ask you to buy cotton interlock, which is a piece of fabric that is knit between two sets of needles, so it doesn't do this curl, which makes you absolutely crazy. But if we look at this piece of knit, cotton knit interlock, both sides look exactly the same. They look like knits on both sides rather than a knit in a purl. And that's because the knit stitches, the loops, are alternating between two sets of needles when it's knit, so it's knit with two face sides. And that means we can use either side. Now, that stitch that I did to show you the wale that I wanted to follow has its correspondent partner here on this piece of interlock, and you can see there's two rows. And there's actually a machine that grabbed the fabric on either side of this change in the knit, and you can see the holes that it's made. So it's gripped the fabric like this and pulled it apart so that a knife can go down and cut the length of the tube to give us a flat piece of fabric. This piece is pretty good, but you can't always assume that a knit is going to follow the rib or the wale as closely as this one does. So you need to educate your eye. And you may need a magnifying glass to begin with. But if you look very carefully at this pink knit, you can see the ribs. And we're going to find one rib and we're going to follow it so that I am on the straight of the grain, if you would. If I try to cut my t-shirt and I am not following the grain, then the t-shirt isn't going to hang correctly. So we're going to be looking for this so that one rib is following along the fold. Now 3/4 of a yard is going to be more than enough fabric to do this little t-shirt. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 folds, or bifold. I'm going to fold the equivalent of the selvage in, and I want it to be deep enough to accommodate the width of the pattern here. So I've got more than enough. I'm going to back it off a little bit, because you don't want to be wasteful. This cotton interlock can be used for trimming on lots of things, so it's a lot of good usable fabric, so don't waste it. Okay, so I have enough width here to accommodate the hip and the bust area of the t-shirt. And once I've got that established, I'm going to look right here on this folded edge and look very carefully to find one rib, or as close as I possibly can get. And then double check it. And all except for the very end here. Okay. So there we have it. Now, if you look at our pattern piece, we've got our lengthwise grain line, and we've got the 2 horizontal arrows coming to the edge of the pattern that are telling us we're going to cut on the fold. Now, because we're using a very narrow seam allowance, because we're going to put this together on our 3-thread sergers, our notches are cut outward rather than inward. Okay? And that's because if we took a clip in what's going to amount to a 1/4 of an inch seam, we would be weakening the seam and perhaps putting a hole in our t-shirts. So in this case, our notches are being cut outward. And since this t-shirt is for girls, the notches, when we put them together and match, our hems match, but you'll notice that there is more length on what amounts to the front of the t-shirt. This is ease, and ease is, in its simplest form, the difference between 2 measurements. In this case, we have a longer front than we do back because we need more length to go over the bust line. And that's what this actual length is. And we will, when we sew it, we will shrink up the long piece and kind of stretch the short piece so that the 2 of them will end up being the same length. We have a binding that's going to go around the crew neckline of our shirt, and it's meant to be cut on the fold. We've got our long lengthwise grain line and the 2 horizontal arrows coming off to this edge, which tell us to cut it on the fold. Now, this pattern has an additional double arrow on it, and I want to point it out to you. It's running at 90 degrees to the lengthwise grain, and it's clearly marked stretch of fabric. Okay? We want the stretch on this interlock to go around our body. The length has got some give to it, but it's fairly stable. But this t-shirt is designed to fit the body closely, and so we want the stretch to go around the body. So when you're working with knits, you will have an additional line that tells you which direction the stretch needs to run, and it makes a difference based on how the pattern was developed. So you need to pay attention to that. The biggest problem with the t-shirt is a lot of students cut the sleeves going in the wrong direction. So you need to be conscious of that, and that horizontal arrow telling you want the stretch of the fabric to go around the arm. So we're not going to make a paper pattern. We're going to trace around the production pattern directly on our fabric using chalk. So you'll need to hold the edge of the pattern piece down tightly against the fabric, because when you drag the chalk across it, the fabric is going to want to stretch and give. You see that? You want to try and avoid that. So hold it tightly against the fabric, close to the edge. Be sure and get your notch traced outward. Double check that you're not moving anything. And that's all there is to this. I'm going to put the neckline binding on the fold. Now you can cut this with the rotary cutter, but the knit is kind of spongy. It has a little bit of loft to it, and so sometimes it gets to be a little bit of a problem. But the biggest issue is, as you cut, if you look in front of my cutter, you see those little humps of fabric that are developing? It's actually stretching, and because I'm pushing, so what's stretching is what's behind the rotary cutter, and I'm pushing the fabric away. And the problem with that is, every so often I'm going to get an inaccurate cut. Can you see this bow right here? That occurred because the fabric was being pushed ahead and away from the rotary cutter. So you can't get quite as accurate a cut on knit. And to try and trim this little bit away can be a little bit of a problem. You end up with kind of a raggedy cut and the potential for some inaccuracies. So I really prefer to use my shears to cut the knit. If you're comfortable cutting with the rotary cutter, go ahead and do it, but just pay attention to what's happening. Don't blindly roll around the outside of your pattern and think that everything is going to stay wonderful. When you're using something like chalk to mark your fabric and stuff, regardless of whether or not it's supposed to disappear in water or in air, they've got these neat pens these days that are air erasable and water erasable. Experience has told me that over time those marks tend to come back. So you want to make sure that anytime you use anything to mark your fabric, that you're marking in an area that's not going to show on the outside of the garment, because if it comes back, you're going to have a permanent mark on the outside of your garment. And that may end up being pretty ugly. Again, I'm trying to use the entire blade of the scissor, but I am not clipping right to the point until I get to the end of a junction. So I've got the shirt back and the binding cut, and I'm ready to cut the opposite side, which would be the front. So again, when I lay this out, I'm going to be looking to see that I've got enough width to cut my piece, putting my front right directly on the fold. Don't ever be tempted to cut around a production pattern. You cannot cut accurately because the oak tag is too stiff, and you end up hacking the oak tag pattern to bits, and that basically destroys the pattern. So don't cut around oak tag. Always trace. I'm going to check to make sure that I've got a single rib running the length, and this one came out perfect. First time. Sometimes that happens. Learn to enjoy it and be thankful for it when it does happen. Get that notch. When you cut around the notches and you're cutting back in toward the fabric, be careful not to cut too deeply. So here's our shirt front. Now we're going to cut our sleeves out of the center. And perhaps the easiest way to do that is to take a long straight edge and sight along it, following one rib. And then we're going to trace our pattern twice. So I'm going to line up my lengthwise grain with the edge of my straight edge. Now, we've always traced with the pattern straight up. There is a very slight difference between the sleeve front and the sleeve back. So I'm going to break that rule and I'm going to flip over so that I'm cutting in the opposite direction. I still want to line up my arrow very carefully with my straight edge, because my straight edge, remember, is running along one wale. Now I'm ready to cut my sleeves. Yeah. I'm treating this layer here as the wrong side. So I'm going to mark the wrong sides of my sleeves, in this case with chalk, but you can use tape so that you'll know what's what and not be confused. And that's all there is to cutting the t-shirt. This would be a usable scrap, binding for another project perhaps. Most of this would be usable. Because knits don't fray, but you do have to consider the space available to hang on to scraps too, because they're like little dust bunnies. They go off in corners and multiply, and pretty soon you're drowning in fabric and you don't know what to do. So all I did with the straight edge was sight it along one rib, or as close as I could get. On this interlock, the yarn is so fine and the stitches are so tiny, if you're off a rib or two, it's not going to make a huge difference. But my goal was to have it run right along one rib, not cockeyed like that. And that's what the old emphasis was on, was finding that rib and following it along the fold when I cut the front and when I cut the back, and then finding one rib and using the straight edge of the ruler to follow the arrow on the lengthwise grain of my sleeve pattern. And that's the whole trick. Learn to identify that one rib or wale. It's going to take a while, and you're going to have to stare at it. So when you make your choices about what kind of fabric you want, take a look at it. You can tell when you're in the fabric store, can I see that wale or not? And color does really make a difference. And be sure and get an interlock, not a single knit like this that's going to curl.